Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics. This week, we're tackling echo chambers. We ask, should we be civil and respectful, even when we're faced with anti-vaxxers and people with extreme political views? Hello, my name is Emily McTurnan, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Echo chambers are a growing concern in today's social and political landscape. These environments are thought to reinforce our existing beliefs and foster distrust of those outside them. Some even argue that those in echo chambers aren't entitled to civility, given that civil exchanges require mutual trust. And perhaps you might even think that moderate incivility is a justified response to views that are epistemically or morally problematic. But what if there's a better way? Today we're going to explore an alternative vision, drawing on Chinese philosophy and the idea of harmony as a framework for engaging with those in echo chambers. My guest today is Carl van Oostrum, whose recent paper argues for reparative civility, a concept that draws on Confucian traditions to rebuild fractured social relations. Carl's a research fellow in political philosophy at UCL's Digital Speech Lab. He specialises in political theory and social epistemology with a particular focus on civility, discourse and democracy. I am delighted that he joins me now. Welcome, Carl. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, your paper's all about people in echo chambers that we're going to talk about today. So who counts as being in one? And why are there something that should be troubling us in contemporary society?
That's a great question, and echo chamber is, still something of a term of art, but I believe that we now have kind of a rough sense in academic and non-public discourse for what we mean when we use the term echo chamber. I think it can mean one or two things. It can mean either that people in these environments are not exposed to information from some relevant outgroup. So, the paradigmatic example might be something like a person who watches right-wing news media failing to see something that maybe the left-wing news media reported more accurately or vice versa. So that's, I think, one thing that people mean when they say that someone is in an echo chamber. So they're in an environment that fails to expose them to relevant testimony. The alternative view is that not necessarily it affects what you're exposed to. Instead, it affects kind of your dispositions to trust the testimony of people that are outside your group. So you could imagine, again, that same example where what happens instead is that when you're watching the sort of left-wing news media person reporting something accurately, for example, that they actually do show you what the right-wing news media person thinks, but then they follow it quickly by saying something like, this person is not to be trusted, or these people are not trustworthy. So you can, for example, be exposed to an environment or the testimony from some outgroup, but then just fail to give it any epistemic weight. So that's the two ways one might think about what echo chambers are.
Are we all in echo chambers?
That's a question I've asked myself, and I think it's a question everyone should really ask themselves. In the end, I think that these phenomena are more common than people think, but what I'm interested really in doing in this paper is not so much examining kind of what these environments do with respect to how they affect what we believe, but I'm interested in seeing whether they affect how you are likely to treat other people. And if you're curious about that, then I'm going to say a few things about what that involves.
Definitely curious. So tell us a bit more about how we're going to treat other people. So the thought is maybe we are all in echo chambers, but there's something distinctively wrongful about some echo chambers. Mm-hmm. Is that the thought? So what's going wrong in some echo chambers?
Yes. Yeah, so what I think is going wrong in some echo chambers is, you can take the point that I mentioned earlier, that they affect what testimony you're likely to trust, at least like the groups of people that you're likely to trust. And, that sometimes can be bad epistemically. It sometimes can be bad for you with respect to forming true beliefs, whether you think that some people are saying something that you're not likely to trust. So, for example, if someone in the flat Earth community distrusts what the scientific community has to say about something, they're definitely going to be worse off. And if we're, in the rest of the community, rest of the world that holds that the Earth is round, we're probably going to not lose anything out by distrusting what the flat earthers have to say, at least with respect to forming true beliefs. But when it comes to echo chambers that involve, let's say, beliefs about moral and political values, the things that we disagree about routinely in society, I think what's going to happen is it's not just going to affect what you believe, but also it's going to make it much harder for you to want to coordinate and talk to people, precisely because if you feel like you can't trust the person you're talking to, you're going to be far less likely to want to do anything kind of pro-social with them.
Great. Okay, so the thought is something like these echo chambers, because they're going to become common, particularly around political and moral divides, just they're going to mean that society can't really get on with things. Is that the picture that's worrying you here?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that the kind of, some kind of ideal social order, some kind of ideals that could guide that social order are going to be threatened by the existence of that, or at least that seems like that is the threat that echo chambers pose.
One last question on the kind of nature of echo chambers before we get onto the meaty questions of how we're going to deal with these. I guess we're here recording this podcast in a university. I guess there's going to be certain people on certain political sides who are going to say the university is a kind of echo chamber that dismisses people outside the realm of academia and prevents us from having a kind of social harmony that you're going to talk about. Are you moved by that, or are you pushed towards a slightly stricter sense of what counts as an echo chamber than that?
And, it might be the case that people in the university are in an echo chamber, but I think they often aren't. And the reason why I think they often aren't is because they are really willing to deal with dissenting opinions. And in fact, if you're doing academic philosophy, if you're not engaging with objections and criticisms, even from people who you distrust, let's say, people in political philosophy who don't engage with the objections of conservatives, for example, I think there's a true sense in which they're echo chambered and a true sense in which they ought to do something about that.
Okay, great. So we should all do better at coming out of our echo chambers. Let's talk about what we're going to do with all these echo chambers in the background. So what should we do when we're confronted by someone in an echo chamber? Let me present the opponent to your line. So I guess there's two things that people sometimes think. So sometimes they think, well, look, the people in the echo chamber have made civil, respectful discussion impossible by being in their narrow echo chamber. And some people might be tempted to something slightly different, which is a kind of moral claim, which is there are certain beliefs we just shouldn't platform. We just shouldn't give credence to. And one of the ways you can give credence to view or give a sense that it's kind of on the table as an option is by engaging with it. And some things should just be not on the table. Are you moved by those thoughts, that there are limits to the views we have to consider?
I think I am moved by that thought in the abstract, but I think practically speaking, it's very hard for, I think, a tolerant society to kind of pick and choose what things it's going to be tolerant about. Similarly, I think it's hard to choose ahead of time what you can be civil about and what views you can be civil towards. That is not to say that I don't think that these views themselves are morally problematic, and I don't think they should be realized in society. But I do think that from the perspective of what we ought to do with respect to people who hold those views, they're not just those views, of course. People aren't just receptacles of views. They are people who are capable of changing their minds about these things. That's going to be an important point, I think, later. But if we consider this objection seriously, I think what one might think is that being civil gives, as you said, right, it gives airtime to these views. It does something, gives them a standing they don't deserve. And, I talked a little bit earlier about how echo chambers undermine this kind of trust that between different social groups. And so you might think that people in these environments, let's say when you confront them about their views, that are racist or sexist views or something like that, and you're genuinely attempting to engage with them civilly, what might happen is that they are unlikely to view your attempt to engage with them civilly as an act of civility. And if that's the case, then you might think, well, what's the point of doing this? If the point of civility, in some extent, is to enact and communicate the tolerance that you have towards other people who have different views, and that doesn't mean accepting those views. It means recognizing that they could be wrong, but then thinking that it's more important for us to coexist in some way. If that's the case, then you might think the point of civility here is lost when we have echo chambers. But I don't think it's lost when we have echo chambers.
So talk to us about that. Why is it not lost, despite everything you've just said?
Why is it not lost? So, I think this argument is extremely compelling, at least when you first encounter it. And I think some version of this is tempting to us, generally when we think about our interactions with people in echo chambers, whether that's online or offline. But I think there's a mistaken assumption in this argument, which is the view that, well, people aren't capable of changing, or rather these relations are not capable of changing in some way. And so I think if you hold the view that these social relations that we have with people in echo chambers are unlikely to change, then yeah, sure. What's the point? But crucially, and thankfully for me, that view is wrong, partially because it rests, firstly on an empirical assumption about how social relations evolve. Believe it or not, they're dynamic. They change over time. They get worse, and they can also get better. And what I'm trying to explore in this paper is the sorts of things that need to go right for those social relations to change. So the takeaway isn't that we need to stop being civil. The takeaway is that we need to figure out what conditions need to be in place for civility to do its magic.
And so the magic that civility can do is it can help us live together well. Is that the thought, or is it stronger even than that?
I think, let's stick with that thought for now. I think when you have that minimal aspiration, it's already extremely attractive.
Okay, great. So we can make things go better by being more civil. But your view's slightly more nuanced than that. Let's try and dive into some of the details of your view, because you don't just go for kind of classic civility, the stuff that lots of us have talked about in political philosophy and in public life. You know, we should be polite and respectful and not tell someone they're an idiot just because you don't like their view or something like this. You've got a much deeper sense of what you're talking about when you talk about civility, that you're drawing from a Chinese tradition. Could you tell us a bit about that? Tell our listeners a bit about your positive account.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is quite a strange place to locate your, let's say, practical prescription for social problems, to turn to some ancient political philosophy. But that's what I do anyway in this paper. And the particular source that I draw from is classical Confucian political theory and moral philosophy. And what I think is important about drawing on this tradition is that these thinkers had this keen sense of how easily things can go wrong, how easily social disorder can arise when we don't engage in certain sets of practices with one another. Things that we don't even necessarily want to do all the time, but things that kind of are let's say, the social lubricant for life to function well. And there's a particular ideal at the heart of the Confucian political apparatus, which is called harmony. And I mean, harmony is one of these concepts that's, at least in this tradition, it's not ever explicitly laid out. But what's interesting about it is I think that it helps inform a way of thinking about civility that's pretty useful for this problem. But let me just say something about what harmony is. So harmony, in the broadest sense, is the process of bringing together things that are different into a constructive whole. So again, that's impressionistic. But if we replace things for social relations, then I think we get something that's actually very familiar to what you were just referring to, that liberal political philosophers talk about. At least recently in political philosophy, we've been fascinated by this idea of a relational turn, the thought that what matters isn't necessarily what we have, but the kinds of attitudes of regard and treatment we have for one another. And the Confucians have thought about this already. They beat us to the punch for a very long time. And what they were trying to do was try to figure out how you could manage social relations, very much the same things that we're talking about in contemporary Anglo-American political philosophy, in line with some particular ideal. And so they say it's about bringing together elements into a constructive whole. What does that mean? It's about creating something like a social order where difference can exist that's not squashed. And I just want to take a moment to say something, because sometimes the concept of harmony is the target of a lot of criticism by liberal political philosophers. So I think people like Judith Shklar often criticized, ideologies of harmony and solidarity, things that were not truly liberal. And so we needed to really minimize the way we thought about liberalism, because concepts of solidarity and harmony seem to really squash individuality and destroy the sense in which we can be free. That is not what is going on here. And I think it's a shame that the concept of harmony is viewed this way. I think partly, if I can go on for another second or two, I think partly it's because, to some extent there is propaganda that the CCP uses. They use the term harmony in ways that don't actually align well with how the Confucians conceived of this. Given
the Chinese Communist Party. And in the kind of current day, this is used as a kind of tool of political repression. Is that the suggestion you're making? And actually that's not what it was meant to be?
Yes, exactly. I use a kind of culinary metaphor in this paper, but a musical metaphor helps that really come out. So, music is quite dull when the same note is being played by everybody. But when there are different kinds of notes in the same key, and even ones that sit outside the key, what's really interesting is that when musicians encounter dissonance, and they don't just squash it, they don't just get rid of it, what they try to do is they figure out how that can be managed to make the overall musical piece aesthetically enjoyable, or if not, tolerable. I think that actually translates fairly well to the way that liberals conceive of when they encounter people who have certain kinds of views that are morally and epistemically unreasonable, how we ought to respond to that fact. So, harmony has that sort of, I think it bolts on quite well to, in short, I think it bolts on quite well to the project of managing social relations.
Just to get a tiny bit of clarity, so there's a few different things moving around here, right? So there's one strand of liberal political thinking that would have something like tolerance and harmony sound quite different to me. So I can see why you focused on civility, which is what you do in the paper. So this is not really a criticism of what you've been writing in the paper, but maybe it's just worth surfacing this tension a little bit more. So I take it that some liberal political philosophers think that tolerance is all about what you're meant to do with people or groups or views that you find distasteful. Right? So it's not about bringing us all into a harmonious whole. It's not about how you can now be best friends with this person and get on really well with them. But it's about how we can live together without breaking into religious conflict or warfare. And so there's nothing of the kind of joyful playing of the music together in the liberal thought. So it sounds like the addition you're making from ancient Chinese philosophy is really pushing us quite far along the line away from a kind of agonistic vision of the politics, right? Where what we're doing is we're fighting it out between factions and we have this bare tolerance just to make sure that we're not getting into fist fights about it. But it's fine that we're in this kind of massive disagreement. We're not in the same key. And I think you are moving us away from that picture of politics where, okay, it shouldn't break into violence, but active disagreement is welcomed into a harmonious sense. Am I right, or am I putting too much emphasis on your musical analogy, right? I've got to bring everyone into the same key. Okay, you can suggest that vaccination shouldn't be given to children, but you can't be an anti-vaxxer, right? You can't really step away from vaccines are good. But you can have some little nuances in the music, some jarring notes. Or is that unfair?
Yeah, so, I mean, I would say that my view does go a little bit further than the kind of, let's say, minimal, let's just coexist. Really what it's trying to do, and I think this is the distinctive Confucian component, though, is it suggests something that I'm not sure that the Anglo-American tradition, when it talks about civility and tolerance, does, which is it suggests that when you encounter someone like an anti-vaxxer or something like that, or a person who holds some kind of morally unreasonable view, that when you encounter this person, you should turn inward and examine your own conduct. And I think it's a really weird idea at first, but that's literally in, I think, Confucius' Analects, the text that he's most associated with, where he says literally something like, when you encounter a morally unworthy person, by this he just means someone who holds the wrong views, turn inward and examine your own conduct. And I can maybe say something about that if we want.
So let's make it, yes, that would be fantastic. Let's get a concrete sense of this. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to meet someone who's an anti-vaxxer, right? Yeah. They think vaccines are poison, they're creating all sorts of medical conditions in children. You know, we're familiar with that view. I'm sure the listeners are familiar with that view. Or I encounter someone who holds, when we're talking about, philosophers like to use this term, what is it we say, morally disagreeable or, morally unreasonable positions. Yeah. And that's usually a code for something like, I don't know, a racist, right? Okay, so I meet this anti-vaxxer, I meet this racist, and I turn inward. That's your suggestion. So let's talk about what that really means and why that's such a fruitful thing to do.
Yeah, so, I mean, as I said, it might sound puzzling at first, but the thought here is that, well, no one's really exempt from the requirements of civility. No one's exempt from this idea that every person is owed, very much in virtue of just being a person, a sort of treatment that's respectful of their basic capacities as people. So, people are capable of pursuing wrong-headed views, like the ones we just mentioned there, and a philosophical code for that, morally unreasonable, is often tapers over a lot. But I think people are capable of pursuing these views, but they're also capable of revising them, and I think that's extremely important. And if that's the case, then to fail to act civilly, I think, in some way disrespects these people. It treats them as obstacles in the pursuit of what might be the right views. And so with the Confucian prescription in particular, what's being said here is that there's something we can do in this fraught-social relation, which we might not be completely responsible for. In fact, maybe they're responsible for it. Maybe there might be other people and other institutions that are responsible for that. But what we suggest is that there's no reason why we should exacerbate the dynamic here. There's no reason why we should make things worse. And if that's the case, and what's remarkable about this, they don't just say that we shouldn't do that. They actually believe that this can have positive effects. They have a thesis about how turning inward and morally improving yourself just ripples outwards. This is a weird claim to make, and philosophers in ancient history were always making these claims about human nature and psychology that, maybe some of them did not stand the test of time, but this one did. And there's amazing work that I'll allude to very shortly that suggests that certain forms of contact with people structured by certain kinds of norms make it possible for a prejudice to be reduced. And that's remarkable. That's like sort of banal sounding idea is extremely powerful and shown even by meta-analyses in social psychology to be true today.
Great. So I meet the racist or the anti-vaxxer, and to respect their personhood, I should treat them respectfully. In addition, I should try and become a better person myself in the hope that this will make them better people. Have I missed anything there? Is there anything to add to that picture?
So, I mean, I think there's some, like, I can get into some specifics of what that process involves. But essentially, yeah, you're not going in there trying to change their mind necessarily. But what you're going in there to do is engender certain kinds of dispositions that, once you develop them and you show yourself to be truly committed to them, it just so happens that people often end up wanting to, out of a kind of social pressure, wanting to feel that way too. So what are these dispositions? What I think is important about them before I get into them is that I think that there's something that sort of sounds funny about saying, oh, when you encounter a person like this, just be civil. I think often this recommendation misses the fact that there are conditions required to become civil. And I don't think, this isn't an instinct that we have. It's kind of like a muscle that we develop. And more specifically, when philosophers refer to virtue, we're trying to say it's like kind of an excellence of character. So what are the things that are important here? So I would say that there are three, really four, but three that immediately jump to mind. So the first is a kind of openness, and by openness we could say it means something like being willing to change your mind, or it could mean the more minimal thing of, just trying to understand why a person would hold the views that they do. And there was this really interesting, I'll get to the other two dispositions in a second, but there's this really interesting passage in the Analects where Confucius is asking people a whole bunch of questions about rites and rituals, which seems really puzzling because Confucius was the wisest person around. Why would he go around asking people about things that he knew about? And partly this was because he was trying to engender a certain kind of curiosity and openness on their part. And sincere open-ended question asking is actually one of the methods that psychologists use today. It's called motivational interviewing. And this process has been used to help people, reconsider their substance abuses and even reconsider their prejudices. So that's like one prescription that Confucius recommended for sort of how we become civil that's been extremely effective. And there are two other ones I can say something more brief about. The second is tactfulness. So this is quite intuitive, but this is the idea of trying to constrain the way that you speak and relate to other people even though you might want to advance your particular moral views on them. And this is partly just because it's more effective to engage in that kind of openness I discussed earlier. And then coupled with a kind of tactfulness, it just seems to get people in the position where they will really want to reconsider what they're committed to. And then the final one is this idea of amenability. This is this idea that sometimes we should just compromise on what we want to gain for our views in every conversation that we have with people. Sometimes we got to pick our battles. And if that's the case, according to them, it'll really start to ripple through. But really, when it comes to dealing with people who hold these kinds of views, we'll really, I think, start to make some progress.
Excellent. What a positive vision of people's individual moral psychology and the hope for it. But I guess the final question would be good to raise is your wider work on this. So I guess some listeners might be thinking, are these individual dispositions really going to do the work? Shouldn't we be thinking about the ways in which social media platforms are structured and the other kinds of institutional things we might need? And I know some of your other work speaks to this. So it would be great to hear kind of alongside this revolution in the ways that we treat each other, what else are we going to need to deal with echo chambers and social media?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this paper kind of exists as one half of the answer to the question, what should we do about echo chambers? And I think that, a lot of us have focused on social media, and in my first sort of take on these issues, on what people ought to do. I wanted to really ground it in this really practical, question of how we ought to engage with people in these day-to-day interactions, things that we don't often think about, things that we think we have complete leeway as to how we ought to pursue them. But turning to what I would like to do with the Digital Speech Lab, I'd like to think about this question of content curation as opposed to content moderation. So content moderation, or the ethics of content moderation, considers the kinds of content that we should prohibit or allow on platforms. And I think there's some really interesting work the Digital Speech Lab has put out, which everyone should check out. But what I aim to do with the lab is focus on the question of content curation. So this is, the fact that social media platforms are going to have to make a decision because there's so many billions of pieces of content. They're going to have to make a decision about what content to recommend. And it's not an immediately obvious answer to what should guide what content is recommended to people, especially when that content is generated by users themselves. This isn't stuff that they're putting out. This is what makes social media platforms very interesting from the standpoint of media ethics or something like that, because they're not, putting out their own content. They're organizing our content. And so that seems like that needs to be subject to certain kinds of norms, or so I think. And with respect to the questions we're dealing with today, one thing that I think we definitely ought to move away from is the kind of system that maximizes divisive engagements with other people, the type of system that incentivizes this sort of thing. Once you move away from that kind of content recommendation regime to something where instead of promoting divisiveness, you promote something like civil interactions between people, you make that the thing that they ought to aim for. I think that, coupled with the kinds of dispositions I recommend here, I think that would really help deal with this in a kind of comprehensive way.
So this is the idea that somewhere like X, what was previously Twitter, you're going to do much better with the algorithm if you've got a high conflict post where everyone's disagreeing wildly, and you're saying instead, whenever someone's instantiating Confucian harmony, X should be promoting that. A nice agreement where we see each other's side and everyone asks open questions. That's the claim?
That's basically the claim. I do believe that when the system is set up in certain ways, it kind of can engender an ethos of a sort of civil ethos where people are willing to engage with other people, willing to engage with people as, purveyors of views, not just puppets for those views. And I think that can really encourage people to, even, when you encounter these people who hold these very unreasonable views, I think that can really make them feel like, it's strange to say that it's important for them to feel like they're being engaged with. But I think that sometimes some people hold these kinds of views very much because I think they were, neglected in society. People never paid attention to them. And then they started to think, well, here's a way I can get some attention for myself. But I think if we were to have a system where conversations about contentious matters ought to take place, and political theorizing about civility is an excellent place to draw inspiration for this, I think that would really help change things here.
Would you also suggest, I guess one thing that people often think about in echo chamber stuff is social media is partly culpable for this, right? Because if you like a certain kind of content, it keeps giving you more and more of that, and so it creates this little world where you're just in your own bubble full of people who agree with you. Are you also open to the idea that they should be being pushed the other view, or are you much more interested in these constructive engagements? Which is the most important thing to counteract echo chambers? Is it these constructive engagements with people outside your echo chamber, or are you actually worried about that? The reason the echo chambers are formed, some people think, is the social media platform pushing you the same content, right? I end up further and further left or right because that's what the algorithm keeps showing me.
It's tricky. I'm tempted to say the former. I think the constructive engagements matter a bit more, precisely just because even being exposed to content from the outgroup in the wrong context will not do anything to make you reconsider your views. But I think that one of the, if I may, one of the big problems I think with how people have been thinking about how to tackle echo chambers is this very sort of behaviorist model where they're tempted to say like, well, it looks like, because another thing I should say is that some people don't believe echo chambers exist. They say, well, it looks like people are exposed to all kinds of news. And, I am exposed to all kinds of news. But, I think people, and maybe people in other echo chambers, for example, people aren't very willing to take seriously what people in other political views and other social groups have to say. And so I think that we need to focus more on dispositions and less on this idea of exposure.
Excellent. Thank you, Carl, for coming on and for that wonderful discussion of echo chambers, ancient Chinese philosophy, and what we should all do to treat each other better in ways that will produce social harmony. So we've been discussing Carl's recent paper, Confucian Harmony, Civility and Echo Chambers, published earlier this year in the Journal of Applied Philosophy. And as ever, we're going to put the details in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we'll be discussing a new report from the Constitution Unit on recent UK political developments. To make sure you don't miss out, subscribe to UCL Uncovering Politics on Apple, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed the show, do consider leaving a review. It really helps others find us. I'm Emily McTurnan. This episode was researched by Kaiser Kang and produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is by John Mann. Thank you for listening to UCL Uncovering Politics.